Hey everyone, it's Stellar Nan. For my latest craft, I made a Final Fantasy VII diorama of the Sector 5 church.
Final Fantasy VII was an incredibly revolutionary RPG when it first came out, with an engrossing story that spanned 3 CDs, and iconic characters that are still loved to this day.
Not only that, but the game also popularized RPGs in the West. There was a lot to love about the original Final Fantasy VII when it came out, with its fast-paced battle system, materia, summons, and a wonderful soundtrack. I feel from right out of the gate of the game, you're forced to face Shinra's oppression over its people, and the first real moment of levity that you encounter is when Cloud falls into Aerith's church. And I also feel the theme of Final Fantasy VII is life. And it's really telling that all throughout Midgar, no plant life is sustainable. But specifically in the Sector 5 church slums, you have this church and Aerith's house that can support flowers, and it's like this little shining beacon of hope. I really enjoyed the remake so far. I can't wait until I get to see how the other ones will turn out. It's been really nostalgic for me.
Oh, Cloud. There's still so much to be done.
First, I took some 1/4-inch balsa wood and cut some 3/8 inch wide strips in different lengths. I added some striking wood grain texture to the soft balsa wood with a pencil. I added a few ovals for the knots and some squiggly lines running past them. I tested out the placement of the scattered planks on the base plaque before I finally glued them into place. Next, I rolled out that Sculpting medium blend to 1/8 of an inch. With an art blade, I cut out a 5-inch mini buster sword. This broadsword needed some stability, so I cut out 3 pieces of 12-gauge wire and pushed them into the clay, then smoothed the surrounding clay over the wires. It needed a little bit more detail before baking, so I cut out more bits of clay, mostly for the crossguard. I scored the clay by cutting some crosshatch marks on both the extra pieces and where they were going to be attached. Then I used a little bit of liquid Sculpey to help attach them together. In order to transfer over those neat sword engravings into the clay, first I cut slits along the lines of this paper pattern, but stopped before reaching the end of each of the lines. The pattern piece was laid on top, and the sword engravings were traced into the clay. To make the thin lines look more like engravings, I used a clay dotting tool to dig out a little more depth. Lastly, this blade needed to be sharpened to be battle ready, so I trimmed away enough clay so that it went from dull to a first-class single-edge blade. Next, I got to forge the buster sword in the oven. But please remember, always follow the recommended baking instructions when cooking clay. For the back of the diorama, I traced a section of the Sector 5 church wall onto some pink insulation foam board. I chose to use a hot wire cutter to cut out the foam. Please note that cutting this material using the same method releases toxic fumes, so please wear an organic vapor grade respirator and goggles. But you could also opt to carefully use a utility knife and make many shallow cuts repeatedly until you cut all the way through. Using some 80 grit sandpaper and a dust mask, I smoothed out the rough edges. But because it was going to be covered with spackle later on, finer grits were not needed. I traced the windows into the foam and then cut them out with a different hot wire cutter attachment while using a respirator. The Buster sword finished baking, so I went back to working on that for a bit. I sanded the freshly baked sword with 80 and 180 grit sandpaper to smooth out the blade. The clay dust from sanding can accumulate really fast, but a compressed air duster or paintbrush can help yeet that dust out of the way. Next, I gave the entire sword a black base coat of paint. Then, the back edge was painted a dark aluminum. The metallic paint I had for the sharper edge of the sword was a little too sheer, so first I added a white base coat before I painted on the silver color in multiple layers. Using the same method I used earlier to transfer the details of the sword pattern over, I transferred the wall lines from the wall pattern into the foam with an art blade. While holding my art blade at a 45-degree angle from the wall lines, I carefully shaved off foam from either side of the lines for each of the bricks to give them more depth. For the window casing, I carved out a shelf around the window openings, 2/5 of an inch into the 1-inch thick insulation foam. To seal the porous foam, I coated the entire wall with Mod Podge. Then I painted a black base coat over the wooden planks and the diorama base. To add more of a concrete stone texture to the foam, I decided to cover the wall with spackle. Spackle is pretty thick though, and I didn't want to completely fill in the details I had carved out earlier. So I watered it down. A little too much actually. Oops. To fix this, all I had to do was add a little bit more spackle to the mix to thicken it back up. Then I painted a thin layer of spackle directly onto the foam. Afterwards, I carefully stippled the spackle over all of the raised surfaces to give it a little more texture. Back to the Buster sword for a moment while waiting for the wall to dry, I added a bit of color to the sword's hilt. Next, using tacky glue, I did a little trick to make rivets by dabbing super small dots of glue with a toothpick on the crossguard. And after the faux rivets dried, they got painted. I decided that it was looking a little too smooth, so I used 80 grit sandpaper to rough up the sword in random spots to give it some battle damage. I found these super tiny 1/8 of an inch acrylic rhinestones that were supposed to be used for nail art or for phone cases. So instead, I used them for a couple of support and magic materia. With a dab of glue, I secured the materia into the proper slots for the equipment to upgrade. Now the Buster sword is finally ready for the battle square. Onto the diorama base. I painted all of the wooden planks a dark chocolatey brown. And while that was drying, I added a quick layer of Mod Podge over the church wall to seal it up for painting just to be thorough. Once that dried, I painted the wall a dark gray. Switching back to the base again, I added some tacky glue in the center and then spread it evenly around with a plastic brush. Next, I took some actual dirt from outside and sifted it into a small container. Then I sprinkled the dirt all over the glue and tapped out all the extra that didn't stick. From there, I wanted to add some shading to the wood, so I made a dark wash using a drop of paint, water, and a drop of dish soap. To apply the wash, I opted to use an eyedropper, but a paintbrush would be fine too. I let the wash run into all the cracks and crevices I had created earlier with my pencil marks in the wood. I like how this shading gives it a little more depth. I wanted to add some highlights too, so I took a tiny piece of sponge, applied a small amount of light brown paint to it, and wiped most of it off. Then lightly dry brush the paint onto the planks.
Hey, watch the flowers!
Next, I decided to make Aerith's yellow lilies. First, I separated out the petals from a faux yellow rose. Then, I cut out miniature petals from them. For each set of 6 petals, I cut and glued 1/2-inch jewelry wire to the base of 3 of the petals. I layered the petals with wire attached on top of each other. Using chain nose pliers, I twisted the wires to join them together. Then, I adjusted the wires to fan out the petals. Oh, and I added a couple of white lilies too. I added the tiniest dots of glue on the visible wires and covered them with the 3 remaining petals for each set of flowers. Next, I needed the stamen, or the pollen-producing inner parts of the flower. So I took some faux cherry blossoms that I had also used to cut out the white lily petals from and remove the flowers from the stems. I slid off and removed the sepals and petals from the flowers. I only needed 6 stamens, so I clipped off the extra ones. To finish up the stamen, I painted the tips, or anthers, brown. While letting the stamen dry, I cut out some window panes out of scrap plastic packaging. For the window's decorative grille, I used some fabric paint that had a fine point tip and dried in a puffy 3D effect. I let the grills chill and glued the stamen into the lilies to complete the flower assembly. To add the flowers to the diorama base, I drilled holes directly into the base with the help of a pin vise by hand. With a generous amount of tacky glue, I slid the wires from the flowers snugly into place. Up until Final Fantasy VI, Square had been making games on Nintendo consoles. They even initially started working on VII on the Super Famicom. But ultimately, they decided they wanted to go forward with 3D graphics instead. Unfortunately, the Nintendo 64 simply had too many limitations, such as hardware and storage, for what they wanted to accomplish. So that's why Final Fantasy VII eventually made the jump to Sony. Now back to the windows. It was time to paint the stained glass. To give the acrylic paint I had a little more transparency, I started off by adding Mod Podge to my palette. Then I added a couple drops of blue, yellow, green, and red paint. Because the stained glass designs are so inconsistent throughout each piece of media, I decided to create my own design template as a loose amalgamation to place the plastic window over and follow. Most people know about the infamous character death scene in the game, but originally, all of the playable characters except 3 from the player's final party were going to be killed off too. But it was ultimately decided that it would take away from the weight and the impact of the game's major death if the others died as well. After slowly building up many layers of paint, the windows were ready to be installed. So I superglued the edges of the window panes. Superglue can cause clear plastic to look foggy, so be sure to only hit the edges and be careful when gluing. To cover up those sharp plastic edges on the back and cover up the rest of the visible foam, I used more of my watered down spackle mix and let it dry. Then I covered it all with the dark gray coat of paint. Once that dried, I started dry brushing the wall. To do this, I dipped my dry paintbrush into a lighter gray paint, wiped away most of the paint on it, then I carefully painted the topmost raised surfaces on the spackle texture. I also added a little bit of paint on the edges of the bricks, window casings, and pretty much any edge that stuck out to add highlights and give the wall more noticeable depth. Just to be a little extra thorough, I added one last extra layer of Mod Podge behind the stained glass. Yes! I was finally able to glue the finished church wall to the diorama base. For the final step and finishing touch, I added leaves from some more faux plants I had. I think these are winterberry holly with round leaves, but more importantly, I think these worked well with the scale of the lilies that I had. So I snipped off a few leaves and glued them into place near the base of each flower. Love it or hate it, it's indisputable that Final Fantasy VII made a big impact on the game industry. JRPGs had a pretty small market outside of Japan at the time, but Square chose to put their faith in Sony, who, during that time, focused on marketing its game instead of its hardware, and spent most of its marketing budget doing just that, millions on all kinds of TV and print ads. This also contributed to the game's success in the West.
This craft was something I actually did last year on Twitch, but decided to completely remake it from scratch just in time for Ongaku Overdrive's 7th virtual show and donate it as a raffle prize. The reason why I decided to make it again from scratch was because I wanted to use a variety of different techniques. For example, the planks were originally made out of clay, but I wanted to try working with balsa wood. Ongaku Overdrive is a group that showcases live video game music and nerdcore at events throughout the year. To find out more information about them, you can visit ongakuoverdrive.com or follow them on their socials. What's your favorite thing about Final Fantasy VII? Let me know in the comments down below. Thank you for watching my video. If you enjoyed it and want to support me, join the Stellar fam by subscribing to my channel. Stay stellar!